Bougiewild, 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 Bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild, 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 Bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild can't be boxed. I'm free to be me. I'm living life, creating legacy. I'm living my dream. They call me extra. They say I'm doing too much. I'm just bougiewild, cause I'm classy with some style. Bougiewild, 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 bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild, 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 bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. I'm rocking my own label. I'm wearing my own brand. See, y'all don't understand that this shit was never planned. Some call me bougie, some call me wild. The funny thing is, it's just my personality and style. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild, 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 bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild is balanced. I don't play. I say what I mean what I say. I'm done slay. Bougiewild is balanced. That I am. I live, love, laughing. I don't give a damn. Bougiewild, 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 bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild is loving yourself. It's knowing yourself. It's trusting yourself. It's being yourself. Yeah. Hey. Bougiewild is loving yourself. It's being yourself. It's being yourself. It's expressing yourself. Yeah. Be original. Do you, it works. Hello, you guys, and welcome to another episode of Transparent Table Talk. I am your host, Bougiewild. Transparent Table Talk is a platform where people are willing to speak about their personal life from a humble, transparent, and a vulnerable place. The purpose of this show is to bring awareness to topics society does not discuss that have people suffering in silence due to shame or blame. The vision is to create a place for people to have conversations without fear of judgment. We're having conversations that I wish someone would have had with me. The goal is to inspire and empower to make a choice to live a happy life. The mission is to heal this hurt world by showing everyone that we all go through things. We have a choice to be reborn and live in the spirit. You guys, I'm excited tonight to introduce our guest. Transparent Table Talk is tonight bringing Stephanie Duesing. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, you guys. She's an author, speaker, and international advocate for people who have cerebral cortical visual impairment, CVI. A music teacher by training, she made major medical discovery in the did I pronounce that right? Low vision fields about the connection between language Pomeranian, 9 guinea pigs, 2 parakeets, a dusky canur named Minnie, people with neurological visual impairments. She hopes to do so with some much needed laughter through. Number one, the font was so small. I realized I got to start wearing my glasses sometime. Because y'all know this is a show about being transparent. And Stephanie, correct me if I did not pronounce your name. So I'm going to allow you to pronounce your name.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say you nailed it. You got my name exactly right, and no one ever does. So you're brilliant and golden. So it's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Duesing, and you said it exactly correctly. And I can't believe you read that whole thing out loud, because of course you had difficulty with it, because we're talking about things that most people have never heard of.
I'm telling you, seriously. So I'm excited to learn about tonight, seeing with words, how a music teacher made a major medical discovery in the field of visual neuroplasticity. Did I say that right?
You did, and that's a mouthful. So yes, I am a former music teacher.
Okay.
And in January of 2017, we discovered that my straight A honor student, genius artist, and water polo playing son, Sebastian, was almost completely blind, and no one knew, not even Sebastian himself. He was 15 years old and just about to enroll in driver's ed. I can't even tell you how close we came to putting that kid behind the wheel of a car, because my son has a condition called cerebral/cortical visual impairment, or CVI. CVI is a brain-based vision impairment that's entirely different from ocular blindness. So when most people think about blindness, they think about everything being dark. That's actually a stereotype. Most people who have ocular blindness actually have some light perception and have some ability to perceive some things. And so the idea of everything being completely dark as for a blind people is actually really rare. Most people who have ocular blindness can see something, see a little bit of some variety. So my son has something called CVI, and that's a brain-based vision impairment. People who have CVI can also have ocular forms of vision impairments in addition to the CVI, or they can just have CVI. And it is actually completely normal for people who have CVI to have normal acuity like my son does. And so my blind son passed every vision test every year because he has normal acuity, and our optometric exams are decades out of date.
So how did you all realize that there was a problem, that there was an issue going on?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because CVI can be a totally invisible disability. There is no way to tell that my son is almost completely blind academically, socially, or physically. If you met him, you would never know. I have photos of my blind son making regular, consistent eye contact from his earliest days. I have photos of my blind son using something called visual guidance at a developmentally appropriate age. I have photos of him as a baby. Visual guidance of reach is where you look at something and then you use your vision to reach for it. My son has almost no vision at all, and I've got photos of that. He had all normal developmental milestones. Literally took the training wheels off his bike when he was 4 and has been riding around our neighborhood ever since, almost completely blind. So we had no idea that my son had any disability of any kind. He was a straight A honor student, and he actually skipped a grade. We actually fought the grade promotion for social reasons. We had no desire to pull my son away from his friends that he had. But it turned out to be the least bad of the 3 options our school district gave us. They said they could not meet his needs academically in the grade he was in. And so we made a very thoughtful and careful transition that over the course of about 6 months, and it turned out to be wonderful for my son. But if you know anything about the grade promotion process, you know that the school district examined every aspect of my son physically, socially, academically, everything. And he sailed through the grade promotion process without anybody suspecting a thing. Nobody knew. And so your question, to answer that, how did we figure it out? It was a miracle and an accident. We figured it out by accident. So we happened to be going through old photos. And I am that mom, not super great in the craft department. And I made my son a baby book of his photos from his babyhood. And then I never touched another picture and never made another photo album again because it's so not for me. And so he was 15 years old, and we were looking through old photos that we literally hadn't looked at for years and years and years. And we have family all over the place, Canada, all Texas, everywhere. And so I was narrating to my son about who was in the pictures because there's a lot of people he hadn't seen for a long time, So I was like, oh, look, there you are with your cousins from Canada, and oh, look, there you are with the neighbors that the house we used to live in that you haven't seen since you were a baby. I was just doing that kind of thing. And we had been looking at baby pictures, and we kind of migrated our way up into the toddler preschool years. And we've been doing this for half an hour. And my son is an only child. So there's only one little kid in these pictures that we're looking at, right? And suddenly a really cute picture of my son popped up on the screen. And I just said, oh, look, who's that? And he was like, how should I know? Yeah. And back in 2017, I had never heard of CVI. I had never heard of face blindness. Face blindness is the inability to recognize faces. And in 2017, I didn't even know it was humanly possible. I didn't know that a human being could be unable to recognize another human face. I didn't know that that could happen to a person. And so my response was like what you just did. Like, what? That's you.
Right.
Looking at pictures of you for half an hour. And you have to remember, my son is a very gifted artist. And he draws and paints with photographic realism when he wants to. And he draws and paints human faces and everything else that he interests him with incredible accuracy and detail and realism. And so I was just astonished because here's my artist who draws beautiful faces, not recognizing his own. And so all the hairs on my back just stood up. I was like, that's not normal, right? That's not normal. So I immediately questioned. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, that's you. And he said, well, if you say so, and so then I was like, well, this is totally not typical. So I started quizzing him, me, my husband, 15 years younger with less gray hair,
Right.
And still obviously us. And he was guessing. My brilliant straight A honor student was guessing, and he was getting them right, but he very obviously wasn't sure. And so then I knew there was something really wrong. And I wasn't scared because my son is so capable in so many ways. It was more like just this mystery to be solved. Like, he's got this really weird quirk that how could you not recognize faces? So it was close to bedtime. Everyone went to bed except for me. And I just set to work on my phone researching. And it took quite a while because there was really very little information that I could find back in 2017. And remember, I didn't know about CVI, and I'd never heard of prosopagnosia, which is the technical term for face blindness. And so it took several hours before I was able to find the right combination of words in Google that was like problems with facial recognition. And boom, prosopagnosia came up. And I was like, aha, this is a real thing. Back in 2017, the information I learned was wrong. What I learned then at that time was that it was a very, very rare condition. Well, we know now, I think it was a month or two ago, the New York Times had an article out saying that 1 in 30 people has prosopagnosia. That's like one kid in every classroom.
Right.
Is face blind. It is a common symptom of a common neurological visual impairment. And in fact, the National Institute of Health just this past year, last year, has recognized that CVI is the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world. We've actually known this for more than 10 years, and it doesn't have a diagnostic code. And so there's actually research coming out of Scotland now showing that indeed 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom has symptoms of CVI. 1 in 30. And so this is actually more prevalent than autism, which is why I'm here and why I'm so incredibly grateful for this opportunity to help raise awareness about this. Because my son, it is terrifying to be blind and to have absolutely nobody know that you're blind. The very next day, we discovered that my blind son had taught himself to navigate by counting his steps and turns as a toddler and had been navigating our own home, our small neighborhood, and his extraordinarily architecturally complex high school that way without any of us knowing that that's what he was doing, because it was all silent, counting silently the steps in his head. And he just assumed that that's what everyone was doing. He had no idea that he was different. And that's the thing. All children who are born with CVI have no idea what typical vision is like because they have never experienced it. They assume that you see what they see. They assume their vision is typical because they don't know. They've never experienced typical vision. And so they cannot tell you, I can't see, because they don't know that they aren't seeing. They aren't seeing what you are seeing.
So help me to understand, what does he see? Just like images or shapes, or is it blurred? I mean, I'm trying to understand.
Sure. So it's easier to talk about what he can't see first. So
right.
He has very severe CVI and is almost completely blind.
Okay.
My son has, let me tell you a little bit about what CVI is first. Okay. So CVI is a brain-based vision impairment. And when light hits the retina at the back of the eye, it is converted into an electrical signal and it travels through the optic nerve past the lateral geniculate nuclei, or the LGN, and it goes to the back of the brain. And that's where visual processing begins. I attended a lecture last summer with Dr. Gordon Dutton and Dr. Arvind Chandna, who are two experts in CVI. And Dr. Chandna was talking about how they've actually measured the amount of time it takes between when the light hits the retina and when there's any conscious perception of sight for that to travel to the back of the brain. And it actually takes 1/10 of a second after the light hits the retina before there's any conscious perception of sight. And what that tells us is that we do not see with our eyes. There's no conscious perception of sight when the light hits the retina. It is not until the signal reaches the brain where we consciously begin to see. And so we quite literally see with our brains. And there are actually humans alive on the planet right now who have no eyes, who can see. And I'll give you a brief description. It will help you to understand my son later. There's a man named Daniel Kish, and he lost both eyes to cancer in infancy. He had, they had to remove his eyes to get rid of the tumor. He lost both eyes, and he taught himself to echolocate like a bat. He clicks his tongue like, and he can actually see with sound. He has no eyes, but he can ride a bike. Daniel has no eyes, but he can read if the letters are 3-dimensional. And he actually teaches other blind people how to echolocate. And this is a thing that he does. So it's quite remarkable. And yeah. And when they put Daniel into the fMRI machine, an fMRI is a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. It's different from a regular MRI. A regular MRI scans your brain and takes a picture of what your brain looks like. But an fMRI is a functional one, and it shows what your brain is doing. And so when they put Daniel into the functional fMRI, what that showed was that his visual cortex lights up, and he literally sees when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds. So they've proven he's literally seeing with sound. So my son, like Daniel Kish, my son's name is Sebastian. He also has unique visual processing. My son is the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally, which means that my son sees with words like Daniel sees with sound. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit what my son can't see, and then we'll talk about what he can see and how he sees, okay? So we talked about how the electrical signal travels to the back of the brain, and that's where visual processing begins. In the brain, there are 2 visual processing pathways. There's the dorsal stream that comes up the top of the back of their head. And I always have to think of like the dorsal fin of a shark to remember that. So there's the dorsal stream of visual processing, and then there's the ventral stream, which kind of comes this way. So the dorsal stream of visual processing in the brain is kind of like the where is it kind of part of the brain. And if you think about, like, if you've ever looked at that children's book called Where's Waldo? And you know how cluttered that is, trying to find Waldo in all of that visual clutter. People who have damage to the dorsal stream of their brains have difficulty or can find it impossible to do activities like Where's Waldo? Their brains just, they cannot see all that visual clutter. It's overwhelming to them. They have difficulty finding a face in a crowded room. They can have all kinds of issues related to like finding a toy in a crowded toy box, right? There's just too much. Their brains can't see all of those things at the same time. So that's one part of visual processing. The other part is the ventral stream, and the ventral stream is involved with visual memory. So when we recognize things, there's different ways we recognize things. Like we can recognize the taste of our favorite food. We can recognize the smell of cookies baking, right? There's also visual recognition. And in visual recognition, in a typical neurotypical brain, we have an image in our brain. So for example, if I say something like, I don't know, the Mona Lisa, right? I have an image in my brain of what that face looks like, what that painting looks like. And it comes right to mind without any effort whatsoever. I know exactly what she looks like. And it's not super detailed, but like the more I try to concentrate on it, the more elusive it is, right?
Right. I get it. I see that. See it.
You see it and it goes, right? But it's there. So in a typical neurotypical brain, we have this picture that exists of things we've seen in the past. And then when we see it again, that new image is compared to the old image and click, oh, that's recognition, right?
Right.
So people who have problems with ventral stream impairment have difficulty with visual recognition because their brains have difficulty forming visual memories or can't do it at all. And different areas of the brain are responsible for forming visual memories of different things. So if you take your right hand and you touch right here above and behind your right ear, that's where the right fusiform gyrus of your brain is. Yeah, right up here. And the right fusiform gyrus is where facial recognition takes place. And so if you have damage to the right fusiform gyrus of your brain, many people very often have prosopagnosia or face blindness. And there's a companion disorder that often goes with that that's called topographical agnosia. And that is the inability to recognize your surroundings. Topographical agnosia and prosopagnosia are processed really close to each other over here. And so when one is damaged, it's really frequent that the other one is as well. So they tend to go together. So my son has prosopagnosia. He has an inability to recognize faces. He also has the topographical agnosia. And so he can't recognize his surroundings. And what that means is, doesn't matter how many times my son walks into our home, walks into his bedroom, walks into a school, anywhere he goes, no visual memory is ever formed of that environment. So functionally, he is blind in his environments because there's no visual landmarks. It's not forming a memory, a visual memory. And so there's also object agnosia. That's the inability to recognize objects. And my son has that as well. And there's also like word, letter, number agnosias. I have a very, very dear friend whose daughter, like my son, passed for typically sighted until she was 12 years old. They didn't know she had CVI until I think it was last year. And it was 18 months ago. Yeah. And this child is brilliant and the mom is brilliant. The mom is an educator and they homeschool. And they have done every single reading intervention, every science-based reading intervention for dyslexia under the sun for this child. And after they figured out the child has CVI and has a letter and number agnosia, they started Braille. I think it's been, I don't know if it's 9 months now, maybe it's almost a year, coming up on a year. This child is reading at grade level for the very first time because she's using Braille.
Wow.
Because it doesn't matter how many times she looks at the letters, her brain cannot form a visual memory of the letter. Just like no matter how many times my son looks at my face, he cannot form a visual memory of my face. So to get back to what can my son see? So my son can't see faces, places, objects. He also can't see biological forms. So beyond having prosopagnosia and face blindness, he also actually can't recognize biological forms like hands, feet, body. He can't recognize his own hands. And so the things that my son can recognize are words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes, because the areas of his brain that are involved in processing and recognizing those things were not damaged. And so he passed for typically sighted because he had visual access to numeracy and literacy. So my blind son passed every vision test every year because he can read the eye chart. He has normal acuity and he can read. And he actually learned to read at the age of 2.5 and was reading and understanding those old Nancy Drew mystery stories that I remember struggling with when I was like in 4th grade. When he was, I think, he was 4. He was in preschool. And those are big chapter books, you know.
So you said that something was damaged. Did he experience some type of injury or something?
Yeah, so I almost died giving birth to my son. So CVI is caused by brain damage. It can be caused by genetic conditions. The reason we have so many children right now who have CVI is because our NICU care has increased exponentially in the last 2 decades. It used to be that these teeny tiny preemies, they often died at birth because they were so small we could not save them. And now, thank goodness, our NICU care is so good, so many of them, we can save them. But what happens is they have brain bleeds, and they have cerebral palsy, and they have epilepsy, and they very often also have CVI. And we got really, really lucky that my son just has CVI. He doesn't have epilepsy. He doesn't have cerebral palsy. He just got CVI. But it was from a brain bleed because my son was not a preemie. He actually was born full term. 3 days before my due date, I was diagnosed with preeclampsia. And so I went immediately to the hospital and I was induced. And I coded from the epidural and my blood pressure crashed to 40/26. I was a code blue. And I almost died. And the last thing I remember is the anesthesiologist, like right in my face saying, "It's okay, close your eyes." And I just got sucked under and I was unconscious. And I got the 6-inch needle of epinephrine to my heart and I was unconscious for the next 6 hours of my labor. My husband was present the whole time. And according to my husband, who was there was no fetal distress because there was a fetal monitor in my son. And for that reason, we were told that I did not have an emergency C-section. So 6 hours later, I woke up. I was paralyzed from the chest down. The nurse was pressing on my stomach saying, "Can you feel a contraction?" And I'm like, "I can't feel anything," you know? And then a couple hours later, I gave birth to what I was told was a perfectly healthy baby.
Wow.
My son had a 9 on his APGAR score. He had a 9. And I was told I had a perfectly healthy baby. And I took him home from the hospital believing I had a perfectly healthy baby. And I just want to say, I'm a former early childhood music and movement specialist. There are more than 2 decades of research demonstrating that high quality music and movement activities in early childhood before the age of 7 have tremendous neurological benefits. Music is the only activity known to science that forces the visual, the auditory, and the motor cortices of the brain to all fire at the same time. There are no other activities known to science that do that. And the reason that's important is because when all 3 of those cortices are fired up, it forces them to communicate through the corpus callosum in the center of the brain. There is no other activity known to science that does what music does for the brain. And so we have more than 2 decades of research showing that music and movement in early childhood improve balance, coordination, proprioception, which is knowledge of where your body is in space, which is important when you can't even see your body, right? Also better auditory discrimination, which is being able to hear the sounds in language, language development, reading ability, math ability, and IQ. So it is tremendously powerful. And my son received tons of accidental music therapy. I'm not a music therapist, I'm just a music teacher, but he got tons and tons of music and movement from before he was born, just by accident of having me for a mom, because I think it's fun. And
so let me ask you this. Okay, you're a mom, like you said, you went through this at during labor.
Yeah.
You were under the impression you brought home a healthy baby.
Yeah.
You're now looking through pictures. You know, he's, what you say, 15 years old. You're getting ready to put this child behind the wheel of a car.
Yeah.
So when you found out that there was a problem, and I'm sure you took him to the doctor and you started doing your research. When you learned that this is indeed, my child has this vision impaired, what did you go through as a mom? Like, how did you cope with?
Thank you. I really appreciate you asking this question. Getting a diagnosis for a blind child who has always, all his life, appeared to be typically sighted was the most difficult thing I have ever done in my entire life. It was horrific. So I'll tell you that we figured out he was face blind with the pictures that one night. And then the next day we figured out that he'd been navigating our own home by counting his steps and turns like an ocularly blind person would do. And that's when I got scared for him, because my son was very focused on going off to university. He was planning on going to downtown Chicago, where he was going to go to university, go to school. And I didn't know if my son would ever be able to live independently. If he's counting his steps and turns, there's no way he'd be safe walking the streets of Chicago like that, right? Without formal training on how to navigate. And so that's when I knew we had to have a formal diagnosis in order to access orientation and mobility training, which I knew he needed to live independently and safely. And so that very next day, I made an appointment with my son's neuropsychologist, who had just done a full neuropsych evaluation for a completely unrelated concussion that had happened the fall before. So this doctor, we came in, I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms: prosopagnosia, object agnosia, topographical agnosia. I was using the correct medical terminology. And this doctor looked at me like I was nuts and said, "I can't help you, and I don't know anyone who can. Good luck with that."
Wow.
And we saw neurologists, we saw optometrists, neuro-optometrists, neurologists, neuro-ophthalmologists, ophthalmologists, neuropsychologists, and we traveled across the country looking for anyone who could diagnose my son's common visual impairment. Remember, CVI is the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world, the #1. And we were labeled crazy by the medical establishment, and we were repeatedly verbally and emotionally abused. I was actually physically threatened by a neuro-ophthalmologist we'd never even met. This man walked into the exam room and put his fist in my face and screamed at me in front of my son without introducing himself. I mean, it was, sorry, I just get upset even talking about it. Yeah. So we ended up having to take my son to Paris. My son, there's a wonderful center in Paris called La Fondation Rothschild. Dr. Sylvie Chokran is the director of the unit of vision and cognition, the director of the research there, and one of the best vision and brain researchers in the world. And with the help of Dr. Gordon Dutton, who's in Scotland, the two of them organized a research study. And so they did a week-long research study just on my son, and it was amazing. And the reason this is so important is because part of the reason we had difficulty getting a diagnosis for my son was because he had a normal MRI. And if you'll remember, we talked about how an MRI just takes a picture of what your brain looks like. It doesn't tell you what your brain is doing. And so we were repeatedly told by the best neurologists in the US that there was no way my son could have a neurological visual impairment and have a normal appearing MRI. Well, that's just wrong. Because an MRI only measures the structure of the brain. It doesn't measure the function. More than 10% of people who have cerebral palsy also have a normal MRI, and yet they still have cerebral palsy because brain damage can be at the microscopic level and not show, and still have huge effects on your brain. And so we know more than 10% of people who have cerebral palsy they've got normal MRIs too, and they believe it's about the same for people who have CVI. So the reason it was so important for us to go to Paris was because Dr. Chakran did a special kind of test on my son called a SPECT scan. And a SPECT scan is a nuclear medicine test that measures blood flow to the brain. Any areas of the brain that are not receiving blood flow, that's dead tissue. And so Dr. Chakran found a significant brain damage from the traumatic birth experience that my son had had. And of course, found brain damage to the right fusiform gyrus of the brain, which explains why he's face blind and has topographical agnosia. And so we brought that information home. And with that, then we were finally able to get doctors here in the US to listen to us. And for those of you listening, I want you to know my son was officially diagnosed by the wonderful Dr. Barry Cran, who's the director of optometrics at the New England Eye Low Vision Clinic at the Perkins School for the Blind. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to, at the end, give you some links to put in your show notes so that families listening who think that they might need to reach out. I've got wonderful links to articles and to the Perkins site, and there's resources that can help you. You don't have to struggle with this alone like we did. So in addition to that, that was in 2018, we also participated in the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at the Shepens Eye Research Institute, which is part of Harvard. Dr. Lotfi Merabet is the director of the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity, and he's also an associate scientist at Massachusetts Eye and Ear, and he's also an associate professor of ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Merabet runs the study there, and Sebastian spent 6 hours in the fMRI for Dr. Merabet back in 2018, where Dr. Merabet captured Sebastian's use of verbal visual processing in the fMRI. And then he and Dr. Barry Cran published a paper in the magazine Neurobiologia about my son not last fall, but the fall before. So they've written a paper about my son. And I will also put a link to that in your show notes if that's okay with you, so people can read it. So to talk about the experience, yeah, it was financially devastating. We had more than $150,000 in medical bills trying to get a diagnosis for what turned out to be a common visual impairment. And remember, I was using the correct medical terminology from that very first appointment after we discovered what he had. And so that's why I do what I do, because what I've learned is that what happened to us is actually not unusual at all. In my son's case, there's no way to tell that he has CVI. You can't tell by looking at him or looking at his grades or looking at how he walks through a room. But the reality is, for a lot of people who have CVI, it's pretty apparent that they can't see. And even for families with children where it's quite obvious that there's something wrong with their vision, they struggle too, because there's no diagnostic code for CVI and the doctors get no training in it whatsoever. And so it doesn't exist to them. So yeah, that's why I do this. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
So when you all discovered that he had the problem, like you said, he didn't realize that what he was experiencing was not normal. So now you all are aware. Now you realize there's an issue. What did he express? Life being like, okay, Mom, I'm counting my steps. I'm remembering this. What else did he share with you that you learned that he had been struggling with, that he developed as normal, but really, from our perspective, he was actually training himself to be as normal as he could? What were the other things he was struggling with?
So I just want to say, it is absolutely terrifying to be blind and have nobody around you know that. Imagine. I have a very dear friend. Her name is Dagbjörg Andresdottir. She lives in Iceland. She's an opera singer and she has CVI. She is legally blind and she was misdiagnosed with autism, which happens all the time, and did not know she was blind until she was 26 years old. So this kind of thing happens all the time, every day, all across the world. And imagine going till you're 26 years old and not knowing that you're blind. My son went till he was 15 and didn't know he was blind. And I know a lot of families now because of my work of teens, and I know older people, adults who have CVI, all of them who went for years, sometimes decades or more, going undiagnosed. And I will tell you, all of them suffer severe trauma from it. Imagine, my friend in Iceland was put in a regular ed PE class. She has something called lower visual field loss. So imagine you can see nothing beneath your nose. You've never seen anything beneath your nose. Her vision's much worse than that. She has other problems too, but that's a big one. Imagine being stuck in a regular ed soccer class for PE and you have lower visual field loss and nobody knows. Imagine.
So what you're sharing with us today on Transparent Table Talk is that we can be misdiagnosed or suffering with an illness and live a life being categorized incorrectly, or we could go to the doctor and tell them that something is going on because we performed our own research, and we can be ignored.
Yeah.
And so you experience, like you said, a financial hardship as well as a traumatic experience, learning that your son was actually blind when you realized he wasn't recognizing faces. That is, you've really educated and informed me tonight. It just makes me look at the world from a different perspective now. You don't understand when people do certain behaviors. You just think about what children in the classroom are being misdiagnosed. They're struggling in the schools because we're not aware as a society of their condition. So it just makes you look at the world from a different place, and it makes you be open-minded, to discovering something new every day. You just don't know. Is what you're telling me.
Well, and what we've learned is that people who have CVI are routinely misdiagnosed with autism. They're routinely misdiagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders. They're routinely, it's swept under the carpet and attributed to other things.
Right.
Instead of being recognized, it's a vision impairment. It's a blindness. It's not autism. I want to be really clear. You can have autism and CVI at the same time.
Right.
Absolutely. You can have both, but a lot of people are misdiagnosed. And
you're just sharing, you're just shedding light on how many other things could be out there that we're not aware of in our country, in which a child or a person could be misdiagnosed because it has just not been discovered by our country in the medical field that we're in. Because based on what you're telling me, Yolanda, look, I went to neurosurgeons, I went to doctors. It took me to go into another country to find somebody to listen to me and study my child for us to bring this diagnosis back to America, for them to even take us serious and take a look at what we're saying. So isn't that what I'm hearing from you today?
Yeah. And I just want to be really, really clear that since 2017, when we discovered that Sebastian had CVI, there's been a tremendous amount of progress. And I want to thank the Perkins School for the Blind and Dr. Lotfi Marabet at the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at Shepard's Eye Research Institute. There's just been a tremendous amount of progress. Last summer, for the very first time, Perkins has had a lot of CVI conferences, but they hosted a Collaboration for Change conference where they invited Dr. Michael Chiang, who is the director of the National Eye Institute, which is a division of the National Institute of Health. And Dr. Michael Chiang was the keynote speaker at the Perkins CVI Collaboration for Change conference, which is huge. We've got the attention now of the National Institute of Health. And last year, for the very first time, the NIH has recognized that CVI is indeed the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world. Whereas when I told you when I first learned about CVI in 2017, I was told online that it was really, really rare, right? And it's like totally not rare at all, right? We've got tens of thousands of people here in the US alone, maybe millions who have it. So yeah, so that things are changing. Things are getting better, thank goodness. That's what I want to be really clear about.
So what is life like for Sebastian since the discovery? Tell us about that.
Well, we returned to the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity last August and saw Dr. Maribet again. And according to Dr. Maribet, Sebastian is the most studied individual in the world with CVI, which is not a badge of honor that my son is thrilled about, but he's happy to contribute to science. He's like, I'm the lab rat. No, but he's doing super well. He's doing really, really well. We had some real challenges because he has other health issues as well that have been a challenge, and despite all that, he's doing really well. So we're just grateful. And I want to thank Leader Dogs for the Blind. They raise and train guide dogs, and they were wonderful with my son, and they paid all his expenses to fly him out to Michigan for a week. And he stayed there, and they worked with him on orientation and mobility so that my son, one of the common symptoms of CVI is something called visual tiring. And it's where, I don't know if you've ever fainted before. I've only fainted once. And when I did, right before I fainted, my vision blacked out. And then I lost consciousness and fell on my kitchen floor, which wasn't fun. But the reason I'm talking about that is because that blacking out, we call fainting blacking out, it actually happened to me. The vision just went whoosh and disappeared, and then I passed out. And so that's a function of blood pressure, that losing of the vision before you faint. People who have CVI have less visual processing power than people who don't to begin with. And so they're much more sensitive to fluctuations in their blood pressure on their vision. And so a very common and well-documented symptom of CVI is losing vision unexpectedly. Like whatever little vision that they have to begin with can just vanish at a moment's notice if they're sick, if they're overtired, overheated, and overstressed. And we actually saw my son go entirely blind and become unable to read his phone after walking 3 miles on a 95-degree day in downtown Chicago. And that was terrifying because that's when I knew, oh my God, he actually goes completely blind and he can't control it, right?
So let me ask you this. Looking hindsight,
yeah.
Is always 2020.
Yeah.
When he was growing up,
yeah.
did you, like, just thinking back, did you notice anything like when you would go pick him up from school? Like, how did he recognize mom and dad when you would come in to pick him up from daycare? You know how our children run to us?
Yeah.
Daycare.
These are awesome questions. You are such a wonderful interviewer. You are really good. I want to thank you. That's a great question. So I want to be really clear. My son was repeatedly misdiagnosed. Repeatedly. So I started raising concerns about my son within days after he was born. But the thing I was worried about was he had just appeared to be sleeping an excessive amount as a newborn. He just seemed to be sleeping. I joined a baby group. I had mom friends with other babies, and my son was sleeping a whole lot more, it seemed like, than everybody else's. And they were all jealous. And of course I was worried, right? Like, why is my kid sleeping all the time? Beyond that, he seemed perfectly healthy. And like I said, we've got photo after photo of him making eye contact, from his earliest days. So he went through every of those child visits, at 3 days and 5, whatever they do, when they're born.
Because you know how they take the baby? I'm a mother of 4. Yeah. And I know the doctors would take the baby and turn them upside down to see if they would throw their hands out.
Yeah, right? He passed every test. And so what I wanted to say is there were tiny little things. So for example, beyond that what seemed like excessive sleepiness in the first week or so after he was born, when he was about 2.5 years old, my son started to express anxiety about going unfamiliar places, or not unfamiliar, but familiar places. So And he called it the I'm nervous game. That was his word for it. He called it a game. And when we were getting in the car to go to like the grocery store, gymnastics class, he'd say, I'm nervous, Mom. I'm nervous. And I'd be like, we're just going to the grocery store, the same one we always go to. Why are you nervous? And he'd be like, I don't know. I'm just nervous. And remember, CVI kids, they can't tell you that they can't see because they don't know their vision's different.
Right.
So here's my brilliant 2.5-year-old who's already reading and writing, who's met every normal developmental milestone, right? And he's just telling me he's nervous. And so I actually did address this with his pediatrician, and I was just told that it was seeking negative attention and just to distract him with other stuff. And so that's what I did. But the next thing we noticed is when he started preschool at the age of 3, my son had separation anxiety. My brilliant, sociable son who's always had no problems making friends, who has always been brilliant academically, who always, it's just seems to be doing brilliantly in every area of life, cried at drop-off every day. And he was one of the older kids. He had a fall birthday. And so it was very strange that my kid, who seemed so socially adept and made friends easily, was having a difficult time at drop-off in preschool. And he cried every single day for 2 years, and then for quite a lot of kindergarten as well. And I just remember being baffled, concerned, and asking his teachers, why is he crying? What can we do? And everyone, his doctor included, was like, some kids just do this. We worry about the ones who can't settle down. And my son always settled down. And so he flew under the radar.
And let's just put ourselves in his position now.
Right.
I don't recognize these faces. So for us, like you said, that, like I said, I'm a mother of 4. Some children do cry, especially as a society. We look at the only child, are more close to their parents. So when we tend to drop them off, they are the ones that typically cry because they're used to being with their parents.
Right.
So I see as a society where we could say, oh, he's just crying because he's away from his mom. But let's really put ourselves where he was.
Oh, yeah, it's terrifying. He was scared.
Terrified.
Yeah, he was.
Because these faces he doesn't recognize. So every day you're dropping me off with strangers.
Right. And people who have CVI are brilliant at learning how to use compensatory strategies to identify people. It's very common for people who are face blind to use voice. They recognize people by their voices. Yeah. They recognize them by the way they stand or the way they walk. They recognize them by the color of their hair or the earrings that they wear, or using logic, like walking into the art classroom, it's probably the art teacher. You know what I mean? That kind of logic, but not the facial recognition that we talked about, where like you have a picture in your brain of the Mona Lisa, and then when you see the Mona Lisa, you're like, that's the Mona Lisa.
Right.
Sure you have. When your brain cannot form a visual memory of something, right? And it was more than that for my son because he couldn't recognize the environment either, and his very best friend was in that class with him in preschool. He had friends there and his very best friend. So it was really mystifying why my child found this so disturbing. And again, remember, there's no way to tell from looking at my son that he's blind. My son has something called blind sight. Blind sight is a function of motion perception. And it's the ability to move through a space without banging into things despite being functionally blind. And we've known about blind sight since World War I. We've known about CVI since World War I. We had all these soldiers come home who survived gunshot wounds to the head and then had CVI because they had brain damage. So we've known about this for 100 years, that people can be blind and walk through spaces without tripping and bumping into things. That is just a stereotype about what it means to be blind. That stereotype of, blind people bump into things, blind people trip over things. That's a stereotype. My son has never bumped into things and tripped because he has blind sight. And again, it's a function of motion perception. There's a wonderful article, which I can also put in your show notes, on NPR. It's called The Blind Woman Who Saw Rain. And it's about a woman who had a stroke as an adult, and she lost all perception of light. Like she went like what we call, like ocularly blind, like the darkness that we talked about. But it's sometime after the stroke, as she started to, a few weeks later, sometime later, she noticed that she could see the movement of the rain on the window. She couldn't see the rain. She could just see the motion of it. And then when she was out walking with her daughter, she could see the motion of her daughter's ponytail as her daughter skipped ahead of her. She couldn't see the ponytail. She could just see the swishing. So motion perception is processed at the back of the brain. And my son has outstanding motion perception. And so it's that blind sight. My son, as he walks, you could put him in a warehouse filled with junk and obstacles everywhere, and where he'd never been before. And he could walk through the entire thing and never bump into anything because he has that blind sight. And like I said, they've studied blind sight since World War I. We've known about it. They just aren't teaching the doctors about it.
Wow. You've really informed us today on Transparent Table Talk. This is a place where we come to be transparent about things. And thank you so much for being transparent with us today about, what you have experienced with your son. What I would like for you to do for anyone, if you could have a conversation or if you could talk to someone based on your experience and what you went through, what would that conversation be?
Well, I think I would tell people that you just never know what life is going to throw at you, and what the negative experiences you have will help prepare you for. And I'm not going to go into too many details, but you did mention at the beginning in my wonderful introduction that I am a survivor of life-threatening child abuse. My mom had Munchausen by proxy, and she repeatedly and deliberately abandoned me beginning when I was 4 years old for attention and sympathy. So I came home from my first day of kindergarten in a squad car. And I just want to say that experience of being repeatedly abandoned as a small child, it was so traumatic and terrifying. And yet I am so grateful now as an adult that I lived through and survived that experience, because that day when we figured out that my son had topographic agnosia and was literally lost every day of his life, I understood the terror. I understood the severity of what he had experienced, because I think a lot of the problems that we see with doctors and low vision professionals who really don't understand CVI very well is there's a lack of compassion for how scary it really is to be blind and not get the assistance that you need. And we weren't asking for surgery. We weren't asking for illegal narcotics, right? We were treated like dangerous criminals because my son needed a white cane and training with an orientation and mobility specialist so that he could navigate safely on the city streets, because he can never, ever drive. He has so little vision. He can never drive. So I am grateful that I had that experience, because it helped me to empathize with my son and to recognize how traumatized my child had been by going misdiagnosed so many years. And I didn't tell all the stories about all the times he was misdiagnosed, but he was big time misdiagnosed. Yeah, he should have been caught. And the reality is, once I understood some of the common symptoms of my son's common visual impairment, it took me less than a minute in my kitchen to create simple screening assessments for CVI. And I was able to screen my son in under a minute in my kitchen using a book and a pencil. So this is not brain surgery. Like we talked about, with my friend who has the lower visual field loss, like it is not hard to screen for these things. Our optometric exams just aren't doing it.
Wow. Well, thank you so much again for coming on Transparent Table Talk to share your experience with us. You've really informed me today. I'm sure you could tell by the look on my face, like, wow, like I've been just sitting here, wow, we typically have a format, but when important things like this need to be said, this is a platform too as well, where you can come and share your experiences about life, because we all need to be informed. We all need to be aware so that we can take the necessary steps to ensure that we are living a healthy life, because it is about living a healthy quality life. So I just want to thank you again so much for sharing that. Definitely send me all of the links. We want to make sure we bring awareness, whatever support. If you ever want to schedule again and just come back, you're welcome. Because like you said, there are a lot of people out here that just need to be aware of this, so we can take precautions and to ensure everyone is safe. Because I couldn't imagine, you used the term earlier, to just be lost every day in your life and not be able to share it with someone, not even to know that something is wrong with me, because I developed this as normal. And
Right.
I've learned to survive, because he had to learn how to survive.
He did, and he covered so well. And I have to tell you, he told me, you asked like what kinds of things, the discovery of his verbal visual processing took months. We had conversation after conversation. How was he getting away with what he was, how was he passing as sighted? We had months of conversations. But that very first day when we discovered that he was navigating by counting his steps and turns, he told me, he said, I always knew that I was way more freaked out about going places than everyone around me was, and I had no idea why.
Wow.
So
I mean, to have that conversation with him after the fact,
right,
that we've discovered this, like, now I can have this conversation to listen to my child. What did you experience? To try to understand, what did you go through as a mother? I'm sure that was a lot to digest, to process.
It was devastating. I would never wish this on another family ever.
So thank you again for sharing your experience with us. I'm sure this is something we could talk about for hours. But thank you so much. And like I said, if you ever want to come back, just jump back on the calendar, because this is something we need to talk about more. This is something that we need to get out. And that's what I'm about. That's the reason why this platform was created, so we can bring awareness, because we want people to live a quality life. And this is definitely something that we need to talk about.
Thank you. I'm very touched, as you can see. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And send me that information, and we can stay in touch, because it is all about us helping each other. That's what it's about. That's about us helping each other.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really, truly grateful, and I would love to stay in touch with you. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, and you enjoy your evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Toby, you crazy. Toby, you crazy. Toby, you crazy. Toby, you crazy.
Bougiewild, 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 Bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild, 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 Bougiewild. I said the universe gave it to me. I said the universe gave it to me. Bougiewild can't be boxed. I'm free to be me. I'm living life, creating legacy. I'm living my dream. They call me extra. They say I'm doing too much. I'm just bougie wild, 'cause I'm classy with some style. Bougie wild, bougie wild, bougie wild, bougie wild, bougie wild, bougie. I'm free to be me, it's what you see in my energy. I'm real with myself, I don't conform to society. I'm free to be me, it's the only way for me to stay true to my identity. I'm free to be me, I'm a person of integrity, something that's not recognized in society. I'm free to be me, it's the only way for me. It's the key to my serenity, you form the social norms. I'm doing bougie wild, bougie wild, bougie wild, bougie wild, bougie wild.